Welcome to IMPRI Web Policy Talk. I request Professor Chattopadhyay to take over this deliberation forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritika. Good evening from Shantiniketan. I am Dr. Shoumodip Chattopadhyay, Associate Professor, Vishwabharati University, and a Senior Fellow at this Impacting Policy Research Institute, New Delhi. On behalf of the Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at IMPRI, I welcome you all to this City Conversation Series. Today is the 14th edition of City Conversation Series. Contemporary urban development in India is driven by the elite aspiration to develop cities as global or world cities. And Indian cities are facing a range of complex challenges and suffer from diverse problems like inadequate urban services, poor financial health, weak governance, and so on. And urban renewal and the associated ideology of decentralization, privatization, participation have become the defining elements in the contemporary mode of urban development. An important component of the in this process of urban restructuring is the strategy towards redeveloping the slums. And this focus on slums is not new. Slum improvement has been an integrated part of British colonial town planning. And also post-independence, the various governments addressed slum improvement and clearance through the respective 5-year plans. And of late, the schemes like Rajiv Awas Yojana or the Slum Free City Mission was targeted to redevelop, relocate, and rehabilitate all the slums. A new national housing scheme was launched in June 2015, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, with the slogan of urban housing for all by 2022. So this term slum is as such is deeply problematic. Slums have become a synonym for urban poverty. And however, neither are all slum dwellers poor, nor not do all the poor live in slums. By making Indian cities slum free or the free of this spatial configuration categorized as slums, poverty will thus not be ended. And it is sort of historical fact that the low income urban residents in India are forced to provide their own housing and urban service solution. And it actually led to proliferation of slums and informal settlements and paralegal arrangements. And all these further facilitate the informalization of urban planning and policy in India. A significant proportion of urban people, especially the poor, explored various political relationships to access municipal resources, that too often by ignoring or violating the existing laws and civic norms. And the slum residents, they are having a hard time dealing with this ongoing pandemic situation. It is impossible to ignore the shortcomings in the way our cities and slums are made. It might be a good time to look back at the way we think about the planning of our slums and cities. The Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at IMPRI, along with Industra Global and Citymakers Mission International, has launched a discussion series, the State of Cities #City Conversations. And in this talk series, we have been engaging with the urban experts to understand these challenges of urbanization and to seek what are the strategies with which we should go forward. And today, we are delighted to have among us Dr. Nipesh P. Narayanan. Nipesh is a research fellow, the Laboratory for Social Geography, University of Florence, and also an associate researcher at Social Science Research Center, University of Grenoble Alpes. And Nipesh works focus on knowledge hegemonies, which he inquires using informal practices, planning systems, and the food preferences in urban Asia. And his work is situated within the larger domain of Southern theory. And his recent research works have been published in reputed journals, Annals of the American Association of Geographers, Planning Theory, and so on. And the title of today's presentation is, Has the Urban Been Depoliticized? He plans to discuss how slums and cities have been depoliticized and the rationality and discourses for legitimizing the state action and how these shape the making of the slums. And we are also today have with us, we are very happy to have with us Professor P. Sridhar, a well-known public policy and inclusive governance specialist. I welcome you, sir, to this conversation series as well. So on behalf of the team IMPRI, once again, I welcome you both, Dr. Nipesh and Dr. Professor Sridhar, for your presence and for your participation. And now it's over to Nipesh for your presentation.
Please unmute yourself, Dr. Narayanan. Dr. Narayanan, please unmute yourself. Yes, okay.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Chattopadhyay, for such a nice introduction to the notion of slums in cities. So I'll directly jump onto my presentation today, which is titled "Has the Urban Been Depoliticized?" Now, it's a very broad topic, both the notion of urban as well as the notion of being depoliticized. So I'll break it down into smaller components, which I will deal with the presentation today. So essentially, if you look at what should a city be, if you look at the question of what should a city be, a large chunk of it is being dealt by urban planning. Now, urban planning, I don't mean only the things which the planners do, but also the reaction of those who are being planned. So in a sense, urban planning in India is mostly done through development authorities, which is a technocratic body, and it comes under the state government. And the local city government or the municipality is kept out of this entire gamut of answering or engaging with the question of what a city should be. In that sense, what we see is that the notion of what a city should be is outside the ambit of electoral politics, because at the state level, the city issues do not pick up in electoral politics. And at the city level, the municipal level elections, those very issues are not part of the municipal governance. On top of that, there is another layer of urban policy, which is made at a national level in the parliament. And theoretically, it is done by the parliament and not the government. So I break this question again to a smaller portion of how has the urban been conceptualized in the parliament? Now, I don't read the entire urban history in the parliament, but I read it through the interventions on slums. So this particular presentation is kind of a funnel down from the urban all the way to the slums. And the notion of depoliticization also is not the larger understanding of depoliticization, but a very specific, smaller notion, which I will come to as we progress in the presentation. So jumping onto the question of what is a slum, let's compare two debates. One in 1957, and one of the MPs in 1957 asked, what is the definition of a slum and which areas are declared slum areas? Now, this is a very pertinent question for us in 2020 to understand what is a slum. But at that time, the question did not get answered. Rather, the chairman of the house mocked at the question by saying, what is the definition of a slum? Physical or mental slum? And the debate ends there. Jumping on to 2014, another MP asked a very similar question about data discrepancy. The question was, the Census Office and the NSSO, National Sample Survey Organization, has come up with two complete different estimates of slum population in India. And the answer to that was that the NSSO has covered only two types of slums, notified and non-notified, and the census has considered three types of slums, notified, recognized, and identified. And thus the discrepancy in India's slum population. So what I want to point at by these two different examples is that in the 1957, there was an undefined understanding of a slum where it seemed completely absurd to define what a slum is, all the way to 2014, where it has become so bureaucratic and so many definitions of slum that there are statistical errors because of this categorization. And it is in this milieu that I ask two questions, which are the core of this presentation, is how has the public understanding of slums changed over a year, both in terms of policy formation and government rationality? And the second, what can this tell us about the conceptualization of cities? The presentation is broken down into three parts. First, I will briefly go through the context and data. And then I will outline the timeline in which I have analyzed the data. And then I will get into the discussions of conceptualization of slums in the Indian Parliament. Now, most of you would know how the parliamentary system in India works, but I'll still briefly outline the thing. As in the Constitution, 7th schedule of the Constitution of India, there are three lists: the union list, the state list, and the concurrent list. Now, land falls under the state list. So that means land rights, tenure, revenue, usage, etc. falls under the state domain. And thus, by default, the urban development is a state subject. Nonetheless, the union government has directives, has been modulating funds and model legislations. And it is this intervention of the union, of the central government, is what I'm analyzing here. And I analyze it through the parliamentary debates. Now, again, I don't take the full set of parliamentary debates. There are two houses in the Indian parliament based on the Westminster system. So there's Lok Sabha, which forms the government, and Rajya Sabha, where members are indirectly elected for a 6-year term, and only 1/3 of them retire every 2 years. One important factor is in Rajya Sabha, the house can never be dissolved. So there's a continuity of members in Rajya Sabha, and because they are elected by the state legislature, there is usually a higher diversity of members. And within the Rajya Sabha, I look at just the question hour, which is 1 hour at the beginning of each session, where the questions are asked by the members to the ministries or to the government. And these questions more often are not related to the legislation which is being dealt post-lunch, which is the main occupation of the parliament. So these questions are fairly independent and have multiple motives where it is being asked. So the key archive of the presentation are derived from these question and answer session. I use the keyword slum and multiple local derivatives like Juggi and other categories to extract. So there are around 1,200 debates ranging to around 12,000 to 15,000 pages of data. And I take it from 1953, the first session, to 2014, the last finished session of the government. And then I supplement it by policy documents. Now the policy documents are post-analysis. So basically, I don't analyze the policy documents for its efficacy or how it is rationalized, but it's to understand the question answer. And the 5-year plans to put the entire question answer session in the general priority trends. Now, if you look at these 61 years from 1953 to 2014, there have been 12 5-year plans. Now, the task here is to basically divide it into certain categories or time periods in which we can look or rather present the question answer sessions of the parliament. And these are the main slum related policies that were passed or implemented in the parliament. Now what I did is, and I'll show the rationality in the later half of the presentation, is to divide this entire timeline of 60 years into 4 categories. Now these 4 categories are not very strict, rather they are fluid. The boundaries are not very clear, but I call them 4 categories because it's easier to present the data. Now, the first category or the first time period, from 1953 to 1971, the slums were identified as a public health issue. So the main term used was not slum, but slum area. So there is an area which is a slum, which we need to identify, demolish, and rebuild, and sort of like an epidemic approach to the slum. And the general rationality is that the state really believed, the central government really believed, that we can demolish all the slums and rebuild them. Well, of course, by the 70s, the understanding shifts, and the government realized that, okay, we can't demolish all the houses. And it's actually, when you demolish a slum, you reduce the housing stock. So let's do this in parts and provide basic amenities. That's the central logic of the second time period. And there is a slight variation in the second time period, which is quite long. Is in the 80s, the National Commission on Urbanization comes up, where cities are considered as engines of economic growth. So economic angle to the entire urban interventions come into play. In the third time period, the housing shortage issues come in, because the national statistics, the slum census in 2001, the first census where slum data was included, comes into picture. And the debates move to more about enabling the market, providing housing, providing amenities. And the final fourth stage, which starts with Rajiv Awas Yojana in 2011, and the central discussion moves to property rights. Okay. Now, in the entire time period, I do not mean to say that the slum demolition stopped, because the slum demolitions were more prominent in the first phase. Does not mean it did not happen in the last phase. On top of that, there was an emergency period in the 1970s when there were extensive demolition, particularly situated in Delhi. And sites and services and other schemes kept coming throughout the 60-year period, as well as worker housing and other experiments keep going. So what I'm here tracing are the major trends in these four conceptual categories of time period which I have created. So if we look all of them in a series, what we see is, in the beginning, it started with, okay, we have to provide housing and we have to demolish slums. In the second period, the demolition of slums takes a back seat, and it's about providing amenities and providing housing. In the third period, there is another layer added to it, is to enable the market so that it can provide housing and amenities. And in the fourth period, another layer of property rights is inserted. So you need to provide property rights, enable the market, provide amenities, and provide housing. Now, when we look at this progression, it looks like the state has progressed from all the way from demolishing slums to providing property rights to slum dwellers. However, I argue contrary in this particular presentation. And how I do this is I take two particular aspects. One is what rationality is driving this change, and what is being measured. So I present the parliamentary debates using rationality and measure, like two keywords which I use. And by rationality, I mean, of course, governmental rationality, the reason for choice towards certain ends, and measurement in the sense what is being measured, helping in attaining those ends, and in turn changing or shaping the rationality. So it's two things which interact with each other. Now, as we discussed in the first part, the slum was seen as a health issue. So basically, the term which was used was slum area, and it was a health issue, which is it's almost like a body part which is infected. So you can cut it and build something new. So you have to demolish all the slums, and everything else. If you demolish the slums, things will improve and everything else can be done. Now, to do this, what needs to be measured is that basically you need to identify what areas to be called as a slum. And the first act which made this possible was Slum Area Improvement and Clearance Act, which provided the government with the tool to identify and demarcate an area as a slum, which will allow then the state agencies to demolish it and henceforth rebuild and improve and all those associated development discourse which goes along with it. Now, because the slum need to be declared as such, in the parliament, then the notion of slum got contested, because once you demarcate an area and call it a slum, it is up for demolition. So in the political sector, it got really politicized on what you would call a slum. In the second phase, the state realized that actually demolishing all the slums is not possible. So we can keep on demolishing slowly and provide better housing. But the main focus was to provide amenities. Now, this was a major shift in the way the discourse changed in the parliament, is that now once you identify an area as a slum, the primary motive of the state was to give civic amenities rather than demolishing it. So whole discussion shifted from what could be defined as a slum in terms of how the basic amenities would be provided. So what got measured was the number of people who don't have access to water or sanitation. Not very detailed, but those were the discussions going on. And population control, planning data, and all these deficiencies in housing and other personal assets which leads to poverty got discussed in the parliament. And the questions in the Rajya Sabha moved from the numbers to be provided, in the sense what areas are declared as slum did not matter, but how much is provided, how many lives are impacted by the water supply that you provided, got more highlight. In the third part, the National Slum Development Program kicks in, where they realize that, okay, even building the housing, the government cannot do it for everyone. This is partially responsible because in the 80s, late 80s, the national housing policy started to be developed. And there was, within the parliament, there was a demand for housing rights, universal housing rights, which across the party lines, the politicians agreed to, but the parliamentarians knew that India does not have enough resources to enact a right to housing. So they decided that we have to enable the market for this to happen. And this is also partially leading to the report by National Commission on Urbanization, which changed the discourse by saying that cities are engines of economic growth. So before this point, in any money being spent on the cities were a social spending. While post, from the late 1980s onward, it becomes an investment. So you need to improve the city. It's an investment which will give returns later. Now, what gets measured is that when you get into the economic discussion, you really need the numbers. So in 2001, was the very first time when the slum was added to the national census, and we actually got the numbers on the numbers on how many people live in slums in India, and migration patterns and other growth rates were highlighted due to this. And with regard to the questions in Rajya Sabha, it shifted to more numbers, in the sense we could now ask, okay, so many people are living in slums, how many new houses are provided? What is the magnitude of the problem? The overall picture started to develop. And new projects like JNNURM, National Housing and Habitat Policy, kicks in. And in the next stage, the state realizes that the property rights need to be given so that the market could be enabled. So that once you have the property right, you can lease the property and develop the housing. So the entire DeSoto kind of a discourse kicks in from early 2010s, and the property rights become the core argument. Now, what needs to be measured is, you need to have the slum census, you need to have the income, caste, and other details of the people, and the land registration and ownership becomes very important for this policy to be implemented. And the questions in Rajya Sabha shifted again to add the magnitude of action, because now the things were clear as to what needs to be done. The question was how it is done, how efficiently the funds are being managed. This is also partially responsible because of the two particular schemes of JNNURM and Rajiv Awas Yojana, which had the unprecedented amount of money being spent on urban areas of India. So the questions in the Rajya Sabha started getting discussed on how efficiently these funds are being managed. Now, if you put them all together, the inquiry of legislation schemes and implementation were continually being discussed throughout this entire period of 60 years in the parliament. And there were, of course, specific cases which came up depending on the dates being discussed. Now, what changed was, in the first phase from 53 to 71, was the contested notion of slum. So the contestation was on what is a slum. In the second phase, the discussion shift to the number provided, in terms of number of houses being built, number of people who got the amenities. And on the third phase, it moved to the magnitude of the problem, because the survey was available. So you realize the percentage of people living in slums for the first time. And in the fourth phase, the debate shift more towards the magnitude of funds and projects. What I mean by this becomes much more clearer in the next part of the presentation, where I present snippets from the actual debates. So in the first part, from 53 to 71, where the contestation about the slum is happening, we really don't have survey data. So all the debates are happening on anecdotal evidence, and under the premise that the definition of a slum has very physical or very pragmatic impact on the area and the lives of people living there, because the slums are going to get demolished once it is marked as a slum. So I'll give you one example from a debate in 1957, where the question asked is, may I know what steps are being taken to ensure that no new slums are created in the New Delhi area? And the reply by the minister is only requesting people not to create slums, because the difficulty is that whenever new construction takes place, these laborers go and squat somewhere or the other, and that is what give rise to principally to these slums. Now you see the reply of the minister, it's very subjective view. It's not something which he really claims from a data which comes from, it's from the experiential use. Now, what happens to this is that the notion of who lives in the slum, what needs to be considered as slum, it's very political. So, another example is a reply where it's, sir, as the dwellers of jhopris are mostly poor men, unable to spend enough money to construct kacha jhopris with thatched roofs, what steps are the government taking to see that what is built anew does not form a new slum? So you see the notion of slum is beyond what is actually marked as a slum. The question being asked is, okay, there is a slum, you demolish, you build something new. How do you make sure that the new part is also does not have the same issues which the initial settlement had? Now this shifts in the second period from 1972 to 1995, where more anecdotal evidence also goes in, but with certain numbers, because planning data is available. So the numbers come from planning estimates. So an example of the question would be whether it is a fact that there is a constant increase in the number of slum dwellers in almost all the cities in the country. And the answer is there's no agency on the central or state level to look at the census of the slum population. However, the growth of urbanization, there is a tendency to increase in the slums. And the amount, the 100 crore to the government of Maharashtra has been given to tackle housing problems. And so there is a number associated with the anecdotal data. And it gets into ballpark figures where suggestions are being made. For example, why don't you reserve a certain percentage of slum dwellers in all colonies that are being developed? For example, you can fix the colony by having 25% of the area which actually get later implemented in the housing project. In the third phase, it becomes completely data driven, because now we have the census, the slum census is there. And the debates move to more number oriented. Now, for example, the question being asked is whether lakhs and lakhs of people in Jhuggi Jhopri clusters of Delhi are living in most pitiable conditions. And the answer gives a very precise number. There is an estimate that around 20 to 25 lakh Jhuggis dwellers and in about 4.8 lakh Jhuggi households in Delhi. So the numbers get more and more consolidated. Now this comes out in multiple debates. And in the fourth phase, it moves into complete statistification, as in because the notion, the policies which the state is implementing are essentially managing funds, which has very precise data. So this example will illustrate how much statistification happens. So for example, the question itself is whether it is a fact that the census 2001 out of the decadal 91 to 2001, urban growth is 30.3%. So it's a very precise number. 66.6% is accounted for by migration of urban areas. Now, the question is very specific, and the answer is also very, very, very specific. As per the Census of India, from 2001, out of the decadal 91 to 2001, urban growth is 31.48 and 29.92. So it's 2 decimal point accuracy which comes in the discussion. So if you see from 2000, early 2000 and 2010s on to most of the parliamentary question answer session, there is an attachment of 10 or more pages of statistical tables which goes with these answers. There is another example of the same, which I think for lack of time I should skip. Now, if we look to conclude, we started with the contesting notions of slums and all the way to providing amenities. So basically, in the beginning, it was considered as an slums were considered as an epidemiology. There is a problem in an area, wipe it clean, put something new, things will improve. Second phase, realize that clean slate theory does not work. So we need to find out some deficiencies and symptoms. So what are the deficiencies? There are municipal services which are not happening. So add on those services, give some water supply, get the electricity there. In the third phase, it moves completely because it's no more a social service, because cities now are engines of economic growth. We need to focus on productivity. So it becomes investment. So we invest in it and we will get returns. And in the fourth phase, it becomes complete neoliberal self-reliance. And in terms of debates, it started with anecdotal evidence. In the second phase, it moved to anecdotal evidence with certain numbers. And in the third phase, it became data-driven debates. And in the fourth phase, it's complete statistification, where the debates are completely statistics-driven. Now, this is what I actually meant by depoliticization in the beginning, is that there is a consensus in what needs to be done, and the contestation is how it needs to be done. Now, the how it needs to be done question is a managerial question. It's a question of efficacy, while what needs to be done is a question of politics. And this is what is being eliminated from the parliament, where the debates have become managerial and the politics of what needs to be done has escaped the parliamentary discussions. I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nipes, for your interesting presentation. Like it's provides a very unique angle of understanding the slum problems in India. Hardly, at least as far as from my point of view is concerned, I hardly seen any kind of academic approach which deals with slums in this way. So it's a real and unique approach, and I'm really thankful to you for presenting this entirely a sort of new dimension to this INPI platform. So just to sum up, like what you mentioned, like you very categorically depicted the evolution of the concepts of slums, how it actually unfolds in the parliamentary debates and so on and so forth. For example, you have mentioned like how it was first the policy response was more or less focused on the demolition part, whereas now since the slums are more or less viewed as an economic resource, because cities are now viewed as an engines of economic growth. So entire these viewing cities from this investment perspective also sort of given a new kind of a new layer to view the slums as a part. And also you mentioned about the debates. First, for example, the how statistification has done. So it's a very nice word, but I like this very word of statistification. So where you mentioned that the debates earlier was mostly based on the anecdotal evidences, and the discussion was mostly political. But how from the second phase and third phase onwards, how there were more and more emphasis on data, the data-driven visualization of the slums, and then lastly you mentioned about the difference between what to do and how to do, and from that perspective we actually try to depoliticize so as to see the concept of slums. So anyway, thank you once again for your exciting presentation. I have some of my question or queries, something like that, but before putting my questions, let me go straight to Professor P. Sridhar, who is among us with today. And just before requesting him to have his comment, just let me introduce him. Professor P. Sridhar is a well-known public policy and inclusive governance specialist, and he is the founding director of Kautilya School of Public Policy. And he is also the chief enabler at the Center for Inclusive Governance, a citizens collective for social actions and public problems. And he was an expert member in the drafting committee of the Joint Legislative House Committee on Conservation of Lakes in Bengaluru. And he has been an advisor to the government of Karnataka's Sakala mission in improving transparency and accountability in governance. And he was also part of various government committees. So it's over to you, Professor P. Sridhar. Your comments, observation, any questions, please.
Well, I think let me start with where we are headed in the constitutional way of things, right? So let me rewind 25 years back when the 73rd and 74th Amendment was passed. And I think that was an interesting phase of our own growth as a nation. You know, I mean, there was, when we were, when we became independent in the 1946, etc., the parliamentary debates was all about how do we prevent balkanization of India. And then over a period of time, we said, oh no, the government, the central government need not do everything. We need to start devolution of certain roles and responsibilities. And then states started getting more and more, roles, powers, and finances. And I think only when the 73rd and 74th Amendment were passed, you started giving legitimacy, at least on paper, for the local self-governments. And I think if that was the desire that was expressed by the parliament, 2.5, 3 decades ago, of saying that we need to devolve power and decision making, and we should also give funds, functions, and functionaries to the local self-governments, the fundamental question remains, why didn't urban planning become devolved to the urban local bodies? And I think you very rightfully said, Nipesh, when you said it was very nice when you asked the question, saying, why isn't the urban local body involved in planning for the city, right? And I think the first thing that we as a nation should do to set right is move the urban planning into the functions of the urban local body, as has been desired by the 74th Amendment, right? It says in as much words what is its desire. And that's where, in my past, there was a PIL that we launched wherein we asked the question saying that how can the Bangalore Development Authority go ahead and create a revised master plan when it's actually the function of the Metropolitan Planning Committee to oversee the preparation of the metropolitan planning of the master plan. More importantly, we asked a second question, that the the Brihat Bengaluru Mahanagara Palika, or BBMP, is the largest body inside the master plan area. However, the mayor of BBMP is not necessarily a member of the Metropolitan Planning Committee. He has to again contest elections and then get elected to the planning body. If that is the case, how do you ensure that the devolution of power has actually happened, right? And I think that's a real crux, and I really like how Nipesh went through the phases of how slums have been considered. But I think rather than looking at slums as a challenge to deal with, I think if cities are engines of growth, then slums can be prevented if we kind of look at how growth itself happens. If you look at the state of any city today, migration is given, right? And if people are coming every single day, and statistics in Bengaluru say that for the past decade or so, 1,000 people have made a one-way migration into the city. If that is the case, where is the urban poor housing? Where is affordable housing being planned in the city? When you separate the planning versus implementation, when you don't take this challenge head on, then you're perpetually creating slums by economic act, right? And you're not preventing through smart planning by making housing affordable for people who are any which ways going to come into the city. And I think with a lot of wonderful insights that Nipesh has given today, I would like Nipesh to comment on how do you see cities as engines of growth, and if we can actually look at affordable housing as a priority that is taken up by urban local body with the urban planning function within itself, we can actually systematically prevent creation of slums over a period of time, because if affordable housing is available, then people will definitely not have to resort to the lesser quality of life that is afforded by a slum today. So Nipesh, I would like to hear that from you, and then probably have one more follow-up question.
Please, yes.
Should I?
Yes, please carry on. Please, please respond.
Yes, Dr. Nipesh, please.
So there were two parts to the question. One is cities as engines of growth, comment on it. And the second is the slum as such. So I will start with the notion of slum. So I have my own difficulties with the term slum. Now, it's an easy term to work with because it's one of the terms which is clearly defined. It's a legal term. It's not an academic term. So when you say, if I take a settlement in I don't know, Mumbai or Delhi and call it a slum, I can easily say it is what the state calls it. So that is the ease with which you can work, but it has its own problems. To put it in a historical context, in the 50s, Old Delhi was a slum. While today you cannot call Old Delhi a slum. It's not like the housing conditions have improved. It's the only part in Delhi where residential population is actually decreasing. Elsewhere it's increasing. So it's not like the housing conditions have improved, but we can't call it a slum anymore. So it's very subjective, and it's related to what you want to achieve by having called an area slum. That being said, in the largest sense, the slum is always a category of housing cluster. It is never seen as a house in itself. And it is associated with poor housing condition, which, as Dr. Chattopadhyay has said in the beginning, that all poor don't live in slums and all slum dwellers are not poor. So if you look at the housing condition, then the question becomes much broader. And that's how I would suggest we need to look at the housing condition of the city, not by looking at slums, but looking at housing as a larger notion. Second is cities as engines of economic growth. Of course, this was created in the 80s, and Charles Correa was the head of the commission. It was quite revolutionary of that time. It was in the 80s, yes, it was needed to be seen as such, but it is an old concept which you need to move on, because the moment you say cities as engines of economic growth, then you start looking at, it's again not my argument, people who have been studying global cities and the network of flow of capital have made this argument, is that if I'm sitting in the parliament with decision-making powers and I see cities as engines of economic growth, I want to invest in Delhi and Mumbai, while Faridabad is probably the largest growing city in India. So once you consider it cities as engines of economic growth, the discourse shifts. So that needs to be very clear in what we want our cities to be. Do we want our cities to be cities as engines of economic growth, or we want our cities to be a place where people can live and thrive? Because the housing issue can only be solved if we see cities as a place for people to live and thrive. Because the moment we see it as engines of economic growth, it is better to have slums. Because if you provide good housing infrastructure in the middle of a slum, the people will be displaced.
No, I mean, that's the reason why I preface the need for affordable housing as a prerequisite, right? If you could look at affordable housing to precede migration and urban planning failures, right? If you set all these three conditions, then probably you will be in a scenario where the so-called creation of slums doesn't become a systemic activity.
Yes, that's again a planning issue, because what happens is the affordable housing is always linked to the market. That for example, in Delhi, when you have to rehouse slum dwellers, oh no, this area is too expensive, you put them out, disrupt the whole set of things. And what we are missing here is the designing of the market itself. In all the discourse, in the entire parliamentary discourse which I have studied, it's always the market is given. While people in economics and business know that market is constructed, it's not a given. So in the policy domain, we always take market as a given. That needs to shift. And that needs to, that shift, in my opinion, again, it's a personal opinion, will happen once the city, politics of the city is given back to the city itself. So in the beginning, Nehru's and all, including Subhash Chandra Bose, Ambedkar, all our big shot politicians were elected at the municipal
Yeah.
He did not have other options. It's different. But that thing has changed. But it has not changed everywhere. If you look at, for example, France, the Prime Minister of France contested to be the mayor of Paris after being, like, he resigned from being the Prime Minister and contested to be the mayor of Paris. So you see, it's, of course, as a political ambition, he feels it's important, the role of the mayor. So, there is a political ambitions, but that role is important. While if you ask who is the chief minister of Maharashtra or Delhi, everyone knows. But if you ask who is the mayor of the city, we don't know them. And the politicians see this as a mode to go beyond, So that needs to shift, I guess. And then only the market can be constructed.
And
I don't know if I was clear in answering the...
No, I hear you, and I also go back to, again, the economic cities as engines of growth, and probably that's the reason the desire to be a mayor of Paris supersedes, the post top position in the government, right? Now, if you go back and look at the debates in the assemblies of our Indian states, how do you think this debate would have evolved? Would you see a mirror image of what is being discussed in the parliament, or would you see a different discourse?
The thing is, it's completely hypothetical answer because I have not studied the debates in the state. But I don't think it will be the same. It will definitely be different because it reminds me of a very recent lecture by Partha Chatterjee, where he says there are multiple Indias. There is one India where it's from the center, and then all the regional languages produce a different idea of India. So it is talking against the plural identity. It's not plural identity. There is a unified identity, but the unified identity of a Bengali speaker as opposed to a Marathi speaker are different. It's just extrapolating and hypothetically from that notion, I would assume that it would be different in different states.
I think when we start taking up a lot more research studies on cooperative federalism, I think we will see this question also articulated, and then probably we'll see it differently. And go by saying that the third tier of the government, the similar debate will have to come in, where if you take the top 100 mayors of the city or top 543 mayors of the city and ask them to debate, will we see a debate that is different from what's being debated in the parliament? Well, I think I would like to pass the mic back to the organizers. And
thank you.
Yes. At the end, I would like to come back to the question.
Thank you, Professor. Please, Professor Sridhar. And now, actually, I request Mr. Samir Unhale. He is the Joint Commissioner, Municipal Administration Department of the Government of Maharashtra. So, if Mr. Samir Unhale, please, if you can chip in and have your comments.
Yeah, so very, very good evening. It was very interesting to listen to, these new perspectives in the daily rut of administration. Very honestly, we do miss out many various perspectives which can, help and aid us understand and comprehend the cyclonic changes, that are happening in urban India. As was rightly said by Sridhar sir and also esteemed speaker, that the issues of slums and cities, I think that dialectics of slum and cities, the dynamics, the interrelations, the dependencies are well documented. And when as an administrative officers, we always had I always feel slums is the greatest administrative dilemma, administrator's dilemma actually. So very often the reflection of slums in city thinking, or the city, as was mentioned, whether the discussions of mayors or the councillors. Let me tell you that the councillors from slum areas are indeed very assertive and vocal, and many discourse and discussions do reflect the issues and concerns of slums in at least the municipal councils monthly meetings that we normally have. How really one would address the issue of slums? So the formal challenges that we have, and the inability of the city as a whole to address to issues of affordable housing for the poor ultimately reflects in slums. So when not dwelling much upon the analysis of that, I would just share some experiences that we had. Under when I was working as a CEO for the smart city of one of the cities in the state, we had tried a very different project. It was more of PPP participation, and it did, of course, in Mumbai. TDR is an important planning tool, and we can compensate the developer to an extent to give affordable housing in lieu of higher sellable components, as we call it here. So if the rule is of only one FSI, then an additional FSI is given if we can provide for affordable housing. And you will be surprised at the housing stock that has been generated. It is quite significant. Which probably doesn't come out. Even the earlier affordable housing / slum improvement programs that we had, it might be, the basic service of urban poor, and especially in Mumbai, due to the higher housing prices, in a way, in counter way, we in fact Mumbai did created lots and lots of free housing actually. In fact, if you look at the number, I won't be surprised if the number is beyond maybe to 200,000 in Mumbai. Of it might be rental housing, affordable housing, project affected persons, resettlements, and in fact one project that we tried here, we are trying in fact, was of, we call it here the cluster development, in which the many of the planning processes which make it costlier. In fact, planning is somehow unaffordable. Unplanned is affordable. That is another urban dilemma that we have. So an experiment was tried in which, in fact, now it's called as cluster development here, one of the cities just adjoining Mumbai, and that is covering almost 500,000 houses if it goes to its logical conclusion. That is the, that is the way the planning and administrative tools have been envisaged and implemented. Yet of course it is to be seen that the political economy that is in play in every cities, every metro area, is quite complex, and therefore it's very exciting to really engage and challenge with it to find out some solutions which would lead to inclusion. So I always feel that in issue of slums, it is security of land tenure, and of course the poor living conditions / building materials. If we really address these two issues by available resources, planning tools, administrative tools, political will is of course very, very important. And I think that is a credible approach and path to redress to issue of slums. And the greater challenges of inclusion in urban world for that matter, and especially for the cities of global south, which have traditionally been exploited financially and resource wise by the then XY whatever. No point going back to those days, but the accumulated poverty of colonialism into the global south is getting aggravated by these current models that we have, and finding issues of social inclusion for housing element for slum free cities, I think is going to be a biggest challenge. And we do feel that greater collaboration among cities is something that needs to be tried. Under the current system, of course the nation state will always be there, but we will have to create and encourage greater collaborations among cities at international level, in which best practices can be better accepted and implemented and replicated in the various cities of the world. So I'm sorry, I couldn't be as studied as our esteemed guest, because somehow, although the better students do land up in administration, they forget academics the next few years they are into, and unable to really contribute in a way of policy comprehension into the discourse. So that was my very, very limited take on greatest administrator's dilemma is related with slums and urban poverty, and how to really to engage, whether are you going to raise down the slums under illegal constructions, or try to take a more comprehensive, compassionate view for inclusion in housing. So Soumyadeep sir, thank you very much. That was my limited, response for what I could really think
No.
of. So thanks a lot. Thank you, Soumyadeep sir.
Thank you, Ronald sir. If you want to respond, Dr. Nipesh, if you have any comment or anything in response to what Mr. Ronald sir said.
No, that's was a very interesting overview, basically an insider's view of the administrator, which comes in. So definitely there are multiple ways in which new housing stock is built, and how cities can cope with housing deficiencies.
Oh yeah, sure. Thanks. Okay. So now I request Dr. Simi Mehta to come in and join us. Dr. Simi Mehta is the CEO of IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi. So yes, it's over to you, Dr. Simi.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Soumyadeep. And I congratulate Dr. Nipesh for such a wonderful presentation. And also Professor Sridhar, glad to meet you, meet you again. And also Mr. Samir Unhale, thank you. It is always a delight to listen to you and your thoughts. Thank you so much for sharing with us, sir. Dr. Nipesh, I have a few comments and questions coinciding with those comments, and it would be great if you could choose to answer. Up to you. So when you talk about cities as engines of economic growth, when I see this as engines of economic growth vis-a-vis messy and hidden urbanization, how do you reconcile this paradox? For people to live and thrive, the focus must be on the quality of life. So certainly in this situation, slums do not provide a dignified living space. And as in the previous lecture, Professor Mahalya Chatterjee had mentioned that the whole term slum, rather the whole concept of slum is derogatory. So the congested living spaces and conditions and the solutions therein are actually appropriate pointers for politics when politics has to enter or come into the foray, at least as much as India is concerned. So when you see the recent Hyderabad civic polls, we just had the news this evening that the outgoing mayor and the civic officials, there is a great outrage against them because they are using the taxpayers' money. And also, we know, and also Dr. Soumyadeep has also written a lot about financing of urban local bodies. We know how starved they are of funds. So they're using those funds to gift themselves iPhones and other expensive stuff. So what are your insights on an ideal politicized urban spaces, if I could put that in a blunt manner? And then secondly, this is also, I am reflecting upon Professor Sridhar's response about cooperative federalism. I believe cooperative federalism is just a theory. In the current parlance, it is actually an attempt to bring in a double engine ki sarkar. And the narrative is so made that only when this kind of a double engine ki sarkar, or if it is at the urban local body level, a triple engine ki sarkar, only when this kind of thing is heralded, only then development is possible. So what are your views on this kind of politicized discourse that actually envisages only a converging opinion? Is there a scope of an alternate paradigm so that we can witness a sustainable urban development? And if you could offer your insights from maybe an Italian experience or a European experience, which you think can provide a best practice. Of course, things cannot be emulated, but of course we can learn from any of the best practices, maybe in India or abroad. So these were my comments. Thank you so much again for your presentation.
Thank you. So the first question is, the engines of economic growth is not me. I'm referring to the National Urbanization Commission of 1985, which said that cities were engines of economic growth, which later became a notion inside the parliament, which affected a lot of policy making which happened. Coming to the second half, or the crux of the question on how to politicize, in my opinion, there needs to be more power to the cities. As Professor Sridhar has already said, we need to implement the 74th Amendment much more on ground so that cities have the power to do what they need to do. If you look at the example, for example, the Mumbai municipal, because we have the commissioner, the entire budget is much more than many of the state budgets in India itself of the city. So it's not about how much money do they have to play around with. So the politicization has to come by how much power they have. It's the general logic of how the politicians run for power than actually money. I mean, it's a joke, but truly, if you are highly qualified politicians, you don't want to be pushing files being a mayor. You want to be someone else. So in that sense, unless we give more powers of what can be done in a city to the local government of the city, it cannot be politicized. The second thing is the larger theme of politicization or depoliticization, which I discussed in the presentation, is that no one in the parliament actually wanted to depoliticize the urban. It happened over a period of time when the way of managing things, the way of bringing in more data, because initially we did not have data, we wanted data, and then we wanted more data, and then in the end, everything is about data, and when you're bogged down by numbers, you cannot think. So that was not a choice made by the parliamentarians, but it is what happened. So the first step to move out of it is to realize that it has happened. And the second question, was it to me or was it to Professor Sridhar?
Well, you could reflect upon it, and maybe if Professor Sridhar could also take it. So I will
Because
just intervene if it is permissible. The mad rush for data. Well, as a student of political science, what we were made to believe or taught to believe was that it was more of having directive principles of state policy into action. And so that is an ideal state of mind which we were built, we were taught to make understand. So thank you for this another insight, and it is I really learned about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, well, thank you, Simi. And just before going over to Dr. Arjun Kumar, let me just put some of my questions, because some of my questions are already somehow related to what Professor Sridhar has commented, or to some extent what Dr. Simi has mentioned. But specifically what I wanted to know or say is that regarding the policy incoherence, which we generally observe in the context of slums in India. For example, on the one hand, we are talking about the inclusive planning, but at the another end, we are seeing that some brutal eviction drives which are taking place in many cities. For example, we are saying that slum-free city missions, which actually try to include the these poor people in the formal planning process. But the suggested procedures for operationalization actually is not there. So what actually is happening that the local powerful actors become all the more powerful to make the use of all the mission funds and all these things, the facilities, according to their very own term. And so how do the policy debates or the parliamentary debates which you have studied? So is there a reflection of this kind of policy incoherence? If you have come across any such debates into your study, and if so, then how to reconcile such policy incoherences? And secondly, also, as we know that the slums are not homogeneous. So this is a standard kind of notion. And then who are the people that we miss out on while planning our cities? Who is the citizen in the imagination of our planners and decision makers, and how it actually gets reflected through the parliamentary debate? And another thing is that this regarding the depoliticization, because I have some experiences of working with this 74th Constitutional Amendment Act and all these things. So, but if we see the present urban governance reforms, then we are seeing that we are seeing that the task of urban policy making now are increasingly being negotiated by by the new institutional forms. For example, the special purpose vehicles, the parastatal bodies, the quasi-autonomous government organizations, and all these organizations, they actually enjoy considerable autonomy from the government. And all this is justified in the name of depoliticization and also a promotion of greater efficiency, which you mentioned. It can be attributed to the economic angle, which generally the slum has experienced in the recent past. And so how do these associated institutional fragmentation, political arrangements, and network determines what happens within the slums? So these are some of my questions. So if you could please reflect on some of them.
Yes, Dr. Nipesh, should I also add some of my questions? Just for the time. Yes, yes. So thank you very much, Dr. Nipesh. It was, the slides were really, I would say, very interesting. And in India, we could not find it, so we chased you to Italy. I have been working in many research institutes looking into these and many social institutes, but me being economist, really looking after data. But anyhow, let me come back to the very wonderful presentation. And I'm glad Professor Sridhar is here so that his presence is making a lot of, also us to raise very pertinent points. And many of the points that has really covered on decentralization, and Dr. Chattopadhyay is also here. They are masters and our seniors. But one thing, in terms of policy, I really thought just to the continuation of your from since independence, since we are moving also to the 75th year of our independence, what we envisaged in 12th five-year plan was for inclusive and sustainable urbanization. We had HPEC also, which estimated all the numbers. And then we came to Rajiv Awas Yojana. Rajiv Awas Yojana, the envision was slum-free India by 2022. We are 2020 right now. And when we see that, then we came to PMAY, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. It also have one component, ISSR, integrated slum, and all the debates and arguments got, sort of approved. And a new thing of SPV came into the effect for smart city and other things. And in terms of number, what Niti Aayog envisaged, as you rightly mentioned, the census and data activism and other things, census estimated around 1.3, 1.4 crores of the slum households. And then we had NSS 2012 estimating around 75 lakhs, 80 lakhs sort of. And there are issues pertaining to the definition you really highlighted. But then in the presence of many multilateral institutions, our government also thought that, okay, we have 1.8 crore slum household. So the PMAY target was fixed at 2 crores, 90% coming from there. And in PMAY, now we have 1.2 crore, out of which 1 crore have been sanctioned. And in that 3 lakh households only coming under ISSR. So that has been the effect. In fact, not even Southern India, which leads our urbanization in India, only Gujarat and MMR, Samir sir has also highlighted, they have only some projects pertaining to slum and tackling these issues. But mostly these issues I have also written in rental housing and other things, that since the gestation period is so high, this becomes very tough urban sort of governance. And we have so many of things to deal with, for example, lakes. Professor Sridhar is working there in Bangalore, air pollution, Delhi, so many things going on that we have now embraced slums as the part of how our area development is. Delhi also recently passed the Property Right Recognition Act just before the election, now nothing, which I thought that would be extended to all of India, so that everywhere there is property right, because now our policy document is also saying in situ slum redevelopment or within 3 to 5 kilometers. So that debate is now, I think, over. We also had something called RERA, rates. RERA, we have also written, myself and Dr. Chattopadhyay in ORF, another thing, what has been the movement. And during this lockdown and this pandemic, we have something called affordable rental housing, complex migrant housing, which has been coming upon because of this disease thing. But one thing which is also becoming prominent because of the scale which Dr. Narayanan is highlighting was the issue of public health. One project I did for IGC there in Patna in Bihar, there we focused on how the slums are formulated. Then we essentially saw that slums are being formulated where they can easily have the wastewater flowing, because solid waste you can transport, and so the environmental and public health risks are also coming upon. And we have now smart cities and other things also coming upon. So I would say that the debate about data also in parliament, or be it CAG, or be it any other of our indices, we really have to get past of it. And in terms of the periodicity, Dr. Nipesh, if you can also put in some of the dimension of what has been the cases by the RWAs or Jhopdi Basti, Dr. Samandeep sir, because that will also bring so much of light that how this political economy activism and in which part of India is also becoming, and which are being very successful. Other than that, I also thought that why not, because we also talk in India about caste discrimination, regional and everything. In Delhi we see any Bihari being called, rickshawala, and then northeast, North Indian mentality, they just want to beat it. And also there in Bangalore or many other places, so slums becoming also a den of these issues. And also how it is coming in light time and again in different cities. Because if we are also thinking to have inclusion, then how we can ignore all this. So very, I would say, very intelligent presentation. Thank you, Dr. Narayanan, for adding this point. One other point also, I thought that, and gentrification, many other points, was the role of private sector participation in terms of our slum development. RAY was not speaking a lot, but PMAY, and now the whole focus is, that. And one of the critique of our smart cities and Amrut has been the lack of private sector participation, that it is not moving. So like Samit sir also said that FAR increased from 1 to 2, that led to addition of so many housing stock. But that is not holding true for other parts of India. In NCR, Salkar rate is also going down, and RERA and other things not becoming effective. And in this last decade, I would say, because of the vacant and non-delivery of our developers, a lot of people have also mobilized. So what Simi was asking, that depoliticized or politicized, now we see a very different India that has a lot of levers. Even the builder association is fighting tooth and nail that the cement price or steel price is rising. So I really thought that in terms of economics, this can be really seen. And in terms of institution, I would also say that, Dr. Nipesh, why don't you add the dimension of MIS and the data, and also the role of PMUs or PMCs, because all the MNCs have now come in. You have ENY, KPMC, all of them now running SUDA or our ministry. So that part is also becoming very very effective, not only in the central government but state government, also city government. I hope Professor Sridhar can tell that how now the local expertise or research and R&D is not, but more so PMC and other things are also coming. That there is an argument of efficiency. I agree, you need new institution for doing things, but how the institutions have also changed over the years. For example, the land is in Delhi is with DDA, that has 30,000 crores in there, and DUSIB. So how the institutions are also evolving, and what we have to see in the Jhuggi Jhopdi department. If you visit any day, there you see a very senior IS, then he is looking into so many of cases, many lines you are up there for property and other things. So the whole institution question is also getting so much messed up, because some other bodies is creating flats, someone other is giving, the beneficiary. So I just thought to bring about all these things into the debate. And I would also lastly, since we are talking about slums, focus on what has been the experiences of projects of slums redevelopment, because there is private sector participation, financing involved, but also there is gestation, so you move those people for there some time, and then there are also O&M related issues of post occupancy that has also come. So people are also not really interested that what will happen, and the willingness to move towards this direction. To continue to your analysis where we are going, I really thought that what do you think, given all so many of plethora of things, that where should India move, and what should be our time related thing in terms of thinking also, or in planning. Implementation is tough, where we should move, because we were really, when Dr. Nipesh was presenting, I was thinking that this is the really mapping of the planning in terms of really how the parliament debate. So that is what all. I really thank you again, Dr. Nipesh. I also request Professor Sridhar and Professor Samirun Halet to also add to this deliberation, to add anything on this specific topic. Yes, Dr. Nipesh.
I'll just take a minute more
Please.
and then try and reconcile with what was said earlier by Nipesh. Uh, the what and how is very important when we look at a future roadmap. All of us will get caught into these debates, but lose focus on where should we be going. And somewhere today, I think the quality of life is something for all of us to measure. Are our cities worth living? Will they be worth living in the next 10, 20, 30 years? And if you start looking and asking that question, then probably how will we use our commons? How will we look at our so-called slum communities will also change. As we speak, if you come to Bangalore anytime, please let me know. There are a few sections I will take you and go to places which are supposedly slum communities, but you have excellent construction that's come up over a period of time in the form of incremental house, right? So all these notions have to be measured with new metrics of the future, which will completely focus on quality of life rather than the definitions of kacha, pakka house and anything else that has been measured over the last many decades. And I think that's something that I would like to hear as well. I know, Nipesh, you have many questions to answer, but wish you all the best and look forward to keeping the debate alive. Over to you, Mr. Samir, if you would like to add something more.
Yeah, actually, we will have to try some innovative ways, because business as usual, what we are trying to do for last, say, 30, 40 years, it might be public policy or the business models or community engagement. I think we have plateaued up and we have reached to a stagnation point. So somewhere we require for a fundamental shift into our policy, our business model, our community engagement that could really able to tide over this problem. Because Professor Sridhar said that, well, whether after 15 years, what would really we do if we want to live in a big city that we are doing now? Whether the life will go from bad to worse or will it improve? So it will be up to us to really improve onto that. And that's where the really challenge and excitement lies, that with this challenge, we have a great opportunity to try something new, see the process to the logical conclusion, and then have a better cities than what they are now. So it's easier said than done, but that's our only hope, only challenge, and that's what we should really be trying to focus on. So thank you, Samir sir. Thank you.
So over to you, Dr. Nipesh.
Yes, I will collate the responses in larger chunks that will make it easier to answer. First, I'll start from below. So the idea of notion of private sector and SPVs and less political intervention. So how I see it, as I concluded in the presentation, there is a part on what needs to be done and there is a part on how it needs to be done. And over a period of time, post, I would say the main cause being the liberalization in the 90s and multiple actors coming in, it has moved to how it needs to be done. That being said, this efficiency of doing things without any interference is not something new. It was there, you can trace it all the way back to Nehru when Chandigarh was being built. Corbusier would write directly to Nehru that this politician is asking me to do that. I don't want to do it. And Nehru would say, okay, shush. And Corbusier delivered like no other planner or architect would have delivered in last 60 years. And same happened with E. Sridharan when he said, I will build the metro, let there be no intervention. And he delivered. So of course, this notion of if you give me a free hand and give me a clear aim, I will be able to do it. But the problem is, how is this aim being designed? Who develops this aim? That is what is getting depoliticized, because we clearly know how to do things. Because if we know how to build a house, even if we don't know, there are multiple places where the houses are being built, we can learn. But what this house need to be is what we need to discuss. And that comes into how Dr. Chattopadhyay was talking about institutional efficiency of SPVs, of getting in private bodies, of getting in these consultants, which really saw a surge post JNNURM, because JNNURM required a city development plan. And most of the cities which could avail the funds did not have enough expertise, and they hired these consultants. And the other day, they have not done a systematic study on it, but I was going through multiple CDPs of different cities, and some of them are by different consultants, consulting bodies. It's not one person, consulting bodies. And sometimes it's copy-pasted text. You know, it's simply that there were people living in the city who knew what the bureaucracy wanted and took that opportunity to smoothen the flow of funds, which of course result in efficiency, because or else JNNURM funds could not be spent in such a short span of period. But what the final outcome is not what was envisaged when when such a huge chunk of money was allocated for the cities. So we need to have this clear understanding of what needs to be done and how things are to be done. So that's the institutional part of it. And second, the first question which Dr. Chattopadhyay was mentioning is the policy and incoherence of the notion of slum. It's a very, 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 very interesting and very pertinent question, because for a policy, you always need a typical of something. So for a slum policy, you need a typical slum. There was one of the papers which got published beginning of this year, called it the Delhi bias. So it's again from the same analysis of parliamentary debates, and you see how this typical slum is created for the slum policy in India, and that typical slum is actually a slum in Delhi. And this is very interesting, because in terms of number of designated or understood slums, Delhi is not on the top. There are multiple other cities where there are slums. And also in Rajya Sabha, there are a lot more diversity of people from all the states. It's not compartmentalized. And I would rather say the representation of Delhi is much lower in Rajya Sabha than the other states. And yet somehow the discourse changes over a period of time, and Delhi becomes, for a lot of reasons, because in the beginning, the central government was responsible for Delhi. Delhi was not even a half state. So post-partition, huge migration from West Pakistan to Delhi, and the refugee crisis happens, and the central government have to take care of it. From that point on, Delhi becomes the reference point. And when it moves to the slum policy, Delhi becomes the typical slum for which the legislations are made. And of course, the central government cannot legislate for the state. So it makes this legislation and portrays it as model legislation which the state can copy. Now, the larger states have many, many other problems. So they end up copying in multiple places. Not only me, multiple other researchers have shown how, for example, the 1956 Act got copied almost word to word in other states just because they had a policy already made, which was made for Delhi. So of course, there is this incoherence of the understanding of slum, which emanate from Delhi because of its political power, which needs to be broken down. And that being said, when we say decentralization, it also means decentralization of the policy. And for a brief period, that did happen when the central government decided to allocate block funds to the states, and states could decide. And I still did not, I could not figure it out why the state took it, why the central government took it back and started to give money in allocations. So that would be an interesting research to look what happened during the block allocation phase.
So okay. So thank you. Just to now, I think if Professor Sridhar, if you want to make any final comments, and then we will move to Mr. Unalai. So
well, I think it's been a fascinating discussion, many ideas, and I'm still trying to wrap my head on what are the next set of things that we can go ahead and research. But a very important question begins with what Nipesh said, and I think we should all reflect upon it. While chain NURM and probably even smart city has resulted in this templatization, copy paste of whatever are the plans that are to be made by different cities, etc. The important question to ask is, whenever these model legislations are done, whenever these templates are done, the expectation is that you will customize it at the state and the city level, right? How is it that we have not created a market for competing ideas to kind of become part of the solution box of solutions?
Yes.
If it's ended up that only one template got copy pasted everywhere else, it shows the poverty of ideas competing to even try and solve a problem. Forget about whether it was solved right or wrong, right? So I think for us in India, I think more and more of us should continue to think of saying that what are the spaces that are getting created as governance changes happen, and can there be competing ideas that will come in and hopefully get through in whatever opportunities come in the future. I'm just saying this as a realist, not as an idealist, right? I mean, ideally we could hope for many things, but as a realist, at least whenever a chance opens up through any of the formats that come in, I think it's very important for all of us, academicians, researchers, and everybody else, to show the way for new set of solutions and fill in this vacuum. Otherwise, there'll always be these copy-paste consultants who will ruin the future of many cities. So with that, I would like to take leave and thank you all for a wonderful discussion.
But now the new or the latest fetish is to give multiple solutions.
Yeah.
Multiple copy-paste solutions. 8 and 12. Yes.
So that will not solve the problem. That will just magnify the problem.
Absolutely.
But more than half of them are international, so you can copy.
So you can choose to kill yourself either with a knife or a pistol. So that's the.
but none of them are really the Indian solutions.
Yeah.
And with a face, I would say the leadership is really missing in this sort of thing. And I would say, as Dr. Nipesh also highlighted, that since we are also evolving, the leadership is also so fragile from civil society or from the political dimension, or I would say also from us, the researchers, because no one is sticking in this sort of research for quite some long time, because so many of things to do. But I'm very glad that Dr. Nipesh really presented and gave his time despite being very busy. He's also moving places to present this very wonderful presentation. Yes. So should we go to
Yes.
Samir, sir?
For his quick comments.
Yes.
Yeah, Arjunji, this is a very interesting discussion. It's all the ideas and range of thoughts that are coming. They're really fascinating, actually. So I was lucky. I think I could join here, but I think I would like to say that the scene is not as bleak as it looks like, because many cities have responded with their solutions. They may not be up to the expectations that we had, but things are moving ahead. We are having options, we're having solutions, and even the consultants part, I feel that it may not be very I might not really blame to that extent, because it was a different idea which came, and the amount of work that has happened is, I think, significant. It is not something, that we could really leave it aside. There, of course, ought to be have limitations in every job we do. But overall, getting the corporate, even the consultant, was a freshness that and the new dimension it brought into the policy making idea. So I personally feel that they ought to also be complimented for the newness that they brought into ideas, and more importantly, I'm happy with the younger generations that are working with through these consultants. In fact, the younger lot which I interacted with, I was working as a state nodal for the JNRM. So the interactions that we had with the younger lot, it was quite amazing actually. So I have great hope from this younger people working through the institutions of consultants, that they will bring up idea leadership that we really require. So thank you, Sambadipji. That's what I wanted to share on that.
So thank you, Mr.
Yes.
Onale.
In fact,
And
they are also very thorough, because yes, many of them are those who are leading are my and Dr. Soumyadip sir senior from JNU.
Can I just come in for 1 minute?
yes,
Please,
please.
Arjun, when you mention about copy paste and international consultants, so I would circle back to my question. I guess Dr. Nipesh forgot to respond to it about international best practice. So if we are talking about international copy paste on one hand, I would really want to know whether such international best practice can be made possible for the Indian scenario as well. Was I audible?
Yes, Dr.
Yeah, you are
Nipesh.
audible. Yes.
Well, I have my own reservations with international best case scenarios, or making the best practices, although they are sometimes quite efficient, because if I have to do something and there are 10 cases presented on what was good about it and what was bad about it, as an administrator, it's very easy to select and do things. But my problem is not with the solutions. Well, this is where probably I differ from Professor Sridhar, is that I don't want more solutions. I want problems. Because the framing of the problem is where the problem lies. That's what I meant by depoliticization, is that problem is fixed, everything else is moving on. Like even the current government, it got a huge electoral jump because of the smart city mission. So it is making, electorally, it is gaining benefit out of it. But the problem remains the same. Like there is no politicization of the problem itself. So I would say, rather than having best case scenarios for the solution, we need some sort of intervention to problematize the problem making mechanisms in the cities.
Yes,
Well,
that is what.
actually, constitutionally, it still says the constitutional position is still to politicize the problem.
Mm-hmm.
The will of the Constitution, the express will of the Constitution, is still 74th Amendment.
Yes.
Whereas planning is supposed to be a municipal function.
Yes.
So
actually, there was a question on the chat box that says that the true decentralization is not fully heard. It is half-hearted, and it's banana decentralization, like the Banana Republic. If you can see the question, which is quite true in the sense. I mean, ever since the 74th Amendment has happened, we have been saying that it's not implemented as well as it could have.
So I mean, our PIL in the Karnataka High Court squarely nails this. And the revised master plan was stayed just because of this. They said that the secretary is not necessarily the secretariat of Metropolitan Planning Committee does not necessarily become the Metropolitan Planning Committee, and the 74th Amendment's expression is not fully taken care of. I do hope that a lot more people will join that bandwagon and take that forward and continue to push for what the Constitution has already stated, and leverage from there on and move forward, saying that politicization is essential. We need not go to, a small town need not go to the state capital to make its case on saying that you don't understand how I want my regional development to happen. Similarly, we don't need, Bangalore need not go to Delhi to ask for how it can be a smarter city than it is already. So I think these are things to do. I mean, and I hope,
Sridhar.
yeah.
So
Aren't these changes contingent upon the political approval?
No, so what happened? No, it's not contingent on political approval. It's only the expression of the constitution that has to be fought in the courts and said that, why are cities continuing to do planning? Why are states continuing to do planning for cities?
No, sir, I just have one interjection. That Simi, hold your guns, and I think we'll also have Dr. Nipesh. We'll have a special lecture by Professor Sridhar on this very issue.
Sure.
No, Dr. Sridhar, yes. So that also, because it's very late here in
yes.
India.
So
Yeah,
just again, once again, thank you to all of you. Just on a concluding note regarding the two fundamental problems which Dr. Nipesh has raised today, that what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. So I think this calls for a better coordination between the various institutional actors and other stakeholders, and maybe a development of a more integrated approaches towards slums. So once again, on behalf of IMPRI, I thank all the panelists, Dr. Nipesh, Dr. Professor Sridhar, and also Mr. Mrunale and Dr. Simi. And we are continuing with this city conversation series, and we hope that you will participate in the future future version of this city conversation series as well. So thank you once again, and a very good night.
And I really got reminded of Professor Gopal Guru, editor of PPW, when Dr. Nipesh said that we need to focus on problems. Because,
Right.
because he's saying that we are not conceptualizing enough. As also, or I think also the problem of Indian left, since I am in JNU, or the opposition, that we are not comprehending enough as a people in democracy, or as Professor Sridhar also saying that this is the will of constitution, as he is saying what is the willingness of political class, but the will of constitution should prevail. So thank you once again, everyone. And Dr. Nipesh, I would say excellent presentation. Thank you
Thanks so much.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor.
Dr. Nipesh, you were saying anything. If you want to have any word.
No, I was just saying thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. All the best. Yes, please take. Thank you, Professor Sridhar and Samir sir. Yes. Have a good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Have a nice day. Yes.